Stevens lived, probably 2 miles from where I lived. And so he gave me the Civil War rifle, and I put it away. And back at that time when the farms were operating there in the town of Frankfort, guns were a big thing. And every weekend, many times at the end of the day, people would gather there. Cecil Linscott, John Guptill, a few of those, and a lot of people gathered there at the egg room where we had right beside the road. And they always had guns with them. And that gun, that Civil War rifle, got fired a number of times by different people. So it worked back then. It hasn't been anything done with it. So when I found the other gun in the attic, that has a date of 1812 on it. 1811, yes. So it's War of 1812 vintage. It's older, this one. And so the only one I knew, it says Canton, 1811. And it's not loaded, but it was loaded. It was loaded. It was in the attic and it had a charge in it.
Wow, cool.
So Ralph Stevens is the one I went to. And he had the barn where he operated. He had cows and he had hay and other things, but he was always doing things. He stuck a rod down through this and then took it out of the barrel and held it down beside it. There was about that much difference in the distance
Hold the mic up.
end of the barrel, so he says there's something in it. So then he took the same rod, he had ground it out and fixed it so it was sharp, and he put it down in a vise and stuck the gun down over it, like this, stood to the side. He didn't stand right behind it, twisted it back and forth, and in a few seconds, the chips of lead came out the barrel, and then the charge of powder came out the barrel. So he was pretty convinced that it went up in the attic, loaded. And
The ones that show up in barn sales and people find in the walls and in the attic of things, I've seen several hundred of them over the years. About a quarter of them got put away loaded.
And yes,
They should all be assumed to be loaded when somebody checks them.
so in these pictures that I have, and these came from various people, just bear with me. When I look at, I'll have to get out of this. It'll take me a while. I'm kind of cumbersome with this thing, but it'll work, I think, eventually. When okay, this picture is my place in approximately the early 1900s. And
Well,
there
it's
are,
not our place now, it belongs
oh,
to David.
it's
and
David's.
Becky.
David and Becky are here in the back seat. And they live at the place where we are now, where we used to be. But this is the barn that was across the road. The house is pretty much like it, except the barn isn't there on the house side of the road. But as I thought about this, there are a lot of people standing around. You can see them. And I'll bet that one of those guys is the guy that tucked that gun up in the attic. It's likely that he was. And there's one here, there's a few people over here, and there's some up by the house. It's a little, there's another one over here, but it's likely that that was where it originated.
Where's the house located?
Where is it?
Yeah, the address.
Do you know where the old school is out front, back of town? If you went out and took the North Searsport Road and went by what's now the assisted living,
Yeah.
it's about a quarter mile beyond that, on the right side.
So an old chicken barn on the other side of the road?
What's that?
Old chicken barn across the road?
Yes, way down, there is. So that's the story, or a brief story of the two guns. And so Ralph Stevens was the guy that I was going to kind of focus on tonight. And he was a person that Arthur knows him, knew him, and a lot of people here did. But he was a guy that didn't want to be made public. He kind of kept to himself. But he did a lot of things with me, and taught me a lot of things. And Rita tonight brought in these two barns. And she said, Rita, you said your father said that Ralph made these.
Yes, Roger Martin gave them to me, he's my brother. And he said that one there, Steve made for Floyd Shields, who was road commissioner, and that he gave it to him to work on the bridges. They, used it for pride to get those big nails out of the wooden bridges.
Yeah.
And Floyd Shields, who is my great uncle, gave it to my dad. And Roger said he's pretty sure that Steve made that out of either a truck axle or a wagon axle.
I think you're probably right. Because he was the kind of guy that could make anything work. If it was busted and he had to fix it, he could do it. Well, if you get a chance to lift this thing before you leave, it's heavy and it's rugged. It looks like probably Steve did make it, because he did that kind of thing. Didn't do it commercially, but he just did it as a favor. And there's another one here that's very similar, only it isn't as heavy. This one, but it's very much like the other one.
And that one there too, my brother Roger said that he made it for, that Steve made it for my dad. He's not sure just why he did, but he's pretty sure that Steve made that for my dad. So again, that's one made out of our truck axle or wagon
Yeah.
axle or whatever. In that day, they used what they had. I didn't realize that I call that like a blacksmith work. I didn't realize that Steve did that. I knew Steve, but I didn't know that he did that.
He had an old hand crank forge, coal forge, with a hand crank on it to blow it, over on the other side of the road from his house. And he would cover it with a big bucket, a big tub, and to keep the rain out of it. And he'd go over there and uncover it and do this kind of thing. He was good at it.
So again, I didn't realize that, but I did realize that my mother had told me, and when they built their house, and I'm thinking from the very beginning, my dad got a used door from a relative of his on the other side. He brought it down and didn't have a window in it. Steve took an old car window and put windows in the door. I have pictures of the door, and I just again, they made do with what they needed
Right.
to do. And it's still there to this day.
Yes, it does make sense. The kinds of things that Ralph Stevens taught me, and I brought another couple of ideas along with me tonight. I can remember I was a young kid. I was probably 10 years old when I first started following Steve around, and he'd always help me on stuff. He helped me build a boat when I was in the 8th grade, and he encouraged me to build a boat. He wasn't just help me, but he, started me going on it. And he would, but he, one of the couple of the things I'll tell you here was very simple ideas. Steve used to do things that were as foolproof as possible. And this is how he taught me to do some measurements. If you were doing an inside measurement, something like in the inside of this to the inside of something down there, don't just stretch a tape out and try to read it, but take a couple of scrap sticks and stretch them out till they touch both ends, clamp them together, and take that with you to whatever you want to measure. There's no eighths or sixteenths or 32nds involved in it. It's just, here's the measurement, transfer it here, mark it, cut it, that's it. Very simple idea, but not very sophisticated. But it's the kind of thing Steve did. The other thing that I remember him teaching me about was carpenter's square. This is a regular carpenter's square, this modern one. It's been, it probably was purchased 10 years ago, but it's aluminum. And most people looking at it would think that every scale on it is marked off in 16ths, like a tape is. One side is, but the other side is not. It's marked off in 12ths of an inch. And most people wouldn't appreciate that. Steve did, because he said you could draw a scale drawing of that thing. If you want to make something if you want to make 1 inch equals 1 inch equals a foot, and if you want to make something, draw something 8 feet, 1 inch, it would be 8 feet, 8 inches, and then 1 mark. It's a big difference. If you want to look at that, you can see it, but it's marked off in 12ths, not in 16ths. And so I've thought about some of those things that he it was comfortable to him, just did it. And Arthur, some of you other people that were around the neighborhood at that time remember him and know how he functioned. It just clicked in his head, and he'd explain it.
Our house was full of drawers everywhere. Drawers under the eaves, drawers here. They didn't always pull out and back in easily, but they were steam drawers, and every inch of space was used. Right?
Yeah, yeah. And Steve, when he would do carpenter work around the neighborhood, but he didn't advertise it. He didn't let it be known that he was a carpenter. He wouldn't call himself a carpenter. But if you were building a building, he was there, and he knew what to do. But he didn't try to puff himself up with that explaining to other people. But he was, and so when in the very early days of farming around that neighborhood, let me find another picture or two. this was Roy Staples' farm in probably the early 60s. And this picture came from Jack Staples. And he had written on it that at that time, Roy had 30,000 laying hens. These weren't broilers that you killed and ate. They were laying hens that were producing eggs for hatching over a period of about a year. And 400 sheep. So there was a lot of buildings, a lot of activity. And at that time, there were 4 Staples brothers living in the neighborhood. And they were all independent farmers. They weren't incorporated. They didn't have any legal agreement among them. But they cooperated a lot. And one thing that they, or more than one, that they cooperated on was hay. Roy at that time, with 400 sheep and the fields that he had, was the one that kind of spearheaded the haying. And they hayed totally, the 4 of them, this farm, Ralph's farm, and ours, and Neil's, and a few others, getting probably 50,000 bales summertime, Arthur, maybe?
I don't know.
A lot.
A lot, yeah.
And one of the people that one of the places they hayed was Ralph Stevens. And part of the reason for Ralph Stevens was that he was so nifty with mechanics. He kept things going. And he never had a tractor that was what we consider a modern tractor in the 50s. He had an old cut-down truck with a double transmission in it or something, but he raked hay with that. And he could rake hay as well as he could with anything, as you could with any other piece of equipment. So he was very instrumental in the farming activity of the neighborhood at that time. And he was just very unassuming.
Didn't Jack or Arthur have a story about him fixing something?
Yeah, you mentioned something about him running his.
Oh, that old jitterbug,
Yeah.
It would get hot. You'd see a steam coming out of it. He'd stop, put some water in it,
Yeah.
continue on. But he, that one, other than that, I don't remember ever having any trouble.
What was the story with Button?
Oh, that was, jumped the fire
Yeah.
to something.
Oh, it was Derek.
Used a lot of water.
I think it was Derek White that was telling me that he was saying he was with him one time, and the thing was running poorly, and Steve stopped, shut it off, pulled the button off his shirt, wound the button into the hole of the spark plug wire into the one hole, the other end of the spark plug were in the other hole, cranked it, went right off. And that was Derek that told me that. He remembers, and I think I remember him doing that. But so that was where Steve fitted into the neighborhood. He was influential, but not. It's hard to explain him. He didn't want to be recognized.
He didn't do this horn at all.
No, he didn't. But when that farm was running, and all the other farms, the 4 Staples brothers, it was active, and a lot of things going on, and a lot of things breaking. and repairing be necessary. And at that time, or earlier than that, Roy was the one that purchased the feed for the 4 farms. And he would order it in Belfast, and we'd have a rail car left up here at the station in Frankfurt. And on that rail car would usually be 600 to 700 bags of different bags of feed. So not every week, but there would be 600 to 700 bags every 2 weeks or so that had to be taken out of that yard. And I remember of coming down out of the rail yard. This is West Hill, where the road spurs off from the logging road. In the summer morning, August, hotter than hell, and coming down, and the post office was right there across the road, right by the brook. A little tiny building, but in it, there was a cooler that had soft drink in it. Had root beer and all the stuff in the water, you know what I mean? So you'd go in there, lift the cover up, and pick out a drink dripping out of that cooler. It was such a pleasant surprise. Really, really refreshing. So that's the way we got the grain. And then after World War II, there was that period of time, most of these bags were burlap bags. And they kept them and sold them to a guy from Massachusetts that would come around every month or so and pick them up and buy them. But right after World War II, there was a period of time that they bagged the grain in printed fabric.
My sister and I had dresses made out of grain
Oh,
bags.
yes. So
Yeah.
what you'd have, you'd load up 100 bags on each truck and come down out of the rail yard and head up the logging road, and there would be people following the truck. And when you stopped, they would say, "I want that one, that one, that one." So you kind of had to keep track of what you had for prints on there. And that, I don't know what they sold it or whether they gave it away or what, but I remember that.
Apple blossoms.
So,
Norris, can I add something to that?
yes, go ahead, Rita.
When you're talking about that, what came to my mind is, my mother and Evelyn had babies at the same time, pretty much, Pauline and Sharon. Some of you know my sister and my cousin. But she said, when they were in the hospital, there was their grain bag dresses hanging from, together, because they were in the hospital. They were gone like 3 or 4 days apart. And I just had to share that, because I think it's funny. Maybe it was some of those bags that came from that.
Yes, very likely. They were used for everything. Curtains, and but fabric that you could use for making clothing, or towels, or whatever. Yep, go ahead.
Do you remember what the weight of those feed bags were at the time? Were they 100-pound bags?
Yes, they would have been 100-pound bags, and the fabric, the burlap, it was heavy burlap, but that fabric that we're talking about here was probably lighter. It was different,
It was
wasn't-
cotton.
Yeah, it was just
Yeah.
cotton fabric. Pretty popular. This would have been right after World War II. I would say 46, 7, 8 in that
Sounds
period. Not later. On these, most of these buildings and on some of the other ones that or in some of the other pictures, they had grain bins on the top. There's a grain bin there on top. And those were in the period when they had grain blown in from a truck. They weren't feeding 100-pound bags, but a 700-bag boxcar would go for a couple of weeks more for the 4 farms. So they were running through a lot of grain at that time.
And what's interesting is there's absolutely nothing there now.
Yes,
Nothing.
I have one from somewhere here.
This is part of the middle where Cecil stockpiles his town. That's all that's there.
Norris, did you say they brought it in by ox cart?
What's that?
Oh, box cart.
Boxcars,
Oh, okay.
yes. So I can remember of where what did I call them? I don't see it, and I'm probably not looking in the right place. Judy took one of that just recently to show you what the site looks like, but there's nothing there.
Tall grass and bushes
Mhm.
and cotton.
I can remember one morning, Christmas morning, we got a call in town here for a fire out there at Norris Staples. Now, that was quite a thought when you were down here and out there and knew all the buildings that were.
Yeah,
But it was a chimney fire in the house.
yeah, I remember that.
And all kids had to occasionally wait for their father to get home and fight in that fire, and they weren't too happy. They wanted to open their Christmas presents.
Weren't the only kids.
I was trying to find that. I thought I labeled it so I could tell what they were, but I'll bring up some of these other ones that, this one that, and I may find it later. This one that I'm showing now is
Isn't it? Is your place?
that's my father.
No, down.
That's the one.
Place.
Anyone know this person? That's Albert Merrill. He, Connie, he's Trapper Grindle's, Ralph Grindle's wife's father. He worked for my father. The ruggedest guy I think I know, ever knew. He could like pick up the end of a piano, single person. But that's who that is. He worked for father for quite a while. And David, this would be taken from about where your mailbox is. This looking toward the other side of the road. And these two buildings were right there, close to the road. The road has been graded up some in the last years, but it was, that was, there was a big barn was right there, and there was a building on it, on the side of it, that was used for packing eggs.
Norris,
Yes.
if you swing the projector, you're losing half of your picture on the wall.
Oh, yes.
Just swing it to the left a little there. There you go.
And let me go to one more that that the barn that was shown in that previous picture is that one right there. There's been shingles put on the side of it, but and the egg building, the egg room was put on the end of it, on the other end, so that barn is the same one that's shown in this picture. And that barn there was moved. I was told that it was disassembled, the parts were labeled, numbered, and it was reassembled down there because the house used to be on the other, the barn used to be up on the hill. That was what I was told. And you can see the school building, the Lane School, right there where that hand is. And on this side is the woodshed that went with the school. And the woodshed was later moved to the other side of the school. And there was another house that doesn't show up real well in this picture, but it shows up better in the original, that you could see up over that shed in the back, about where the hand is, that was called the Heidman place. Do you remember that, Roger? Do you remember that cellar that was up there? There were two cellars up there on the hill, back of Lane School. And there was a barn up there, and there was another house that was a lane, originally a lane house, over further in the blueberry field, that was way before my time.
Is that
I don't-
Daniel Lane?
What?
Was that Daniel Lane?
I don't know.
'Cause
Probably.
There's a story in the
Yes.
Seekins book about that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the other lane that I remember, down there, across from where you live, Arthur, there was a Henry Lane. They call it the Hen Lane Hill. And that was almost across from Frankfurt School.
Oh, yeah.
That was, so that was a Lane neighborhood.
Horace?
Yes, Horace Lane, yes.
Tim Kingsbury always said that our barn was the last standing Lane barn in Frankfurt.
Yeah, yeah. There's another picture here that Arthur gave me that I wanted to show you. Well, there's a couple more. There's one right. Let's see. I don't know if I showed you this one. I had never seen this picture before, but it's Ralph K. Staples is Arthur's father, Ralph Kenneth, and that would have been a picture taken probably in the 30s somewhere. I think so. And this one that I had never seen before, but it made sense when I saw it, because that's my father in the standing. And in the wheelbarrow is Miles Landry, and he worked for the Staples brothers on the farms. And the reason for showing it was that Miles must have won a bet, either a political election or a prize fight, this was in the days of Joe Louis and the prize fighters back then. Prize fighting was a big deal. You heard it on the radio. Well, if you won the bet, the person that lost the bet had to give you a ride in the wheelbarrow. That was it. It wasn't a very monetary designated prize, but so Miles must have won the bet. Father lost it.
And Norris still has the wheelbarrow.
Yes.
That picture's the lane, is Staples Lane right there.
Yes.
That you're looking down.
Yeah.
Whose clothes are hanging on the clothesline?
Yeah. So the Stuart Parker's house is right there where that arrow is, or somewhere in that vicinity. That,
So-
that field would be right across from the
Assisted living.
assisted living
Yeah.
house. Yeah,
Oh.
assisted living place, yes. And let me see what else I have. Now that's Ralph's place, which is right across from, David, that would be right across from where you live, and with the buildings in place. And Ralph used to, this would have been in the period where after the grain bins had been put on those buildings, so it was blown in grain. Wasn't bags, but Ralph used to brood chickens out here. He had a boiler in that building, and that was heated with no insulation. All those buildings, little insulation, I guess shavings in the roof, but that was it. It was, oil was cheap in that period of time.
Do you have
And-
a picture of the brooder stoves? Did you have one of the chickens around a brooder stove?
Yes, I do.
I think that's
I'll
amazing.
have one. I'll show it. I think I have. Right here. That barn that was across the road, David, from your place, was where my father brooded chicks. And there were 3 floors in it. And there were like 5 of these coal stoves in that building. Like 15 of them, total barn. And I never can understand why that building didn't burn down. I really can't. Because here there were shavings on the floor. There was a chance for getting in a fire, and it never did. Your place never did either, Arthur. Roy had some fires up there afterward, but it was later in his life. But it must have been a certain amount of care given to managing those fires and to not have it burn.
A lot of care.
Yeah. And a little luck, you know.
So did they manually put the coal in that?
What's that?
Did they manually put the coal in?
Yes,
So that would, how long?
twice a day.
That's a lot of work.
You'd up 3 floors in 2 buckets. You'd one on each hand, and you'd shake the coals down till you saw the coals through down in the fire, and fill it right to the top, and do that again late in the afternoon, and then the next morning.
When we
But-
got ready to sell the farm, the realtor came out and every flight of stairs had to have railings. David, you don't know, but none of them had railings before we bought it. And his father would go up and down those stairs, no railings, bucket of coal in each hand, up and down those stairs, same in our 3-story barn, no railings on the stairs.
So if they were brewed their your own chicks, was there a market for the cockerels and the roosters and the spec
Well,
layers?
they usually went for meat. When they would buy, like in the spring, 5,000, 6,000, they should be sexed pullets. They should be females. Well, the sexing wasn't that great at that time. So you always knew that there was some males in that population. But you couldn't tell them until they got a little bigger.
Start vocalizing.
Yes. But the process, what happened to me is I was in 4-H at that time. So when they got to be big enough to recognize the males, I was given the males, or some of the males, and I would raise them to 300 or 400 to market size to sell for meat. And we would kill them for meat. On a Saturday, we'd slaughter chicken. And that was, what you did with those that you couldn't keep for hatching. Because they were hatching eggs that we were producing. It wasn't meat birds, but you had to get rid of them some way. So you could sell them.
So Norris, where did the chickens come from? Was that from the hatchery over?
No, they're not there. They didn't come from Winterport. They would come from other hatcheries out of state. One of them was Maryland, Delaware, and some of them would come to the post office, but if you had 6,000 to 7,000 delivered, they would come by truck in their own truckload. But if you had just a few boxes, they might come at the post office.
They still do.
Oh,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That's where our chicks come from.
But that was because what they would do with the birds is these were white rock females, and when you bred them to be meat birds, they put a different male with them, so they didn't want any of those white rock males in there. They were a different breed, and they would mix them in as they housed them for the hatching season.
So was your father an independent farmer, or was that part of a co-op that would take?
No, they were independent. Right after World War II, the poultry industry grew pretty fast around here, and then it faded as fast. But during World War II and after, it was a big supporter of the community. A lot of people.
Who were they marketing? Who were they selling them to?
They were selling those eggs to hatcheries that would produce meat chicks that would be put out in poultry houses to grow up to be whatever, 12, 15 weeks. And I don't remember in the early days of the poultry industry of there being a lot said about barbecued chicken and fried chicken and stuff like that. A lot of the chicken was bigger.
For stewing.
But then they started that in Belfast, the business of,
Yeah, and the border festival.
yes. They were trying to, that was the beginning season. And here in town, as I mentioned, going up to the rail yard and getting grain in the late 40s, early 50s, Lawrence Hussey was raising birds too. And he had a hardware store there, right as you turn up West Hill Road. The building, I think, is gone. But he was, and there were quite a few other places around town where poultry was raised. It wasn't raised as hatching, brooding stock like we did. It was raised more for meat, and there was quite a lot of that at the time. So it's, but it's all gone.
So how old was your father when he started raising the chickens, and how old was he when the chicken business went away?
It would have been late 40s, early mid-40s probably, right at the end of World War II, when he started getting into it pretty seriously.
Was he a young man at that point? Was he a teen, like a 20-year-old?
He would have been, geez, I don't know when he was born, but he would probably have been in his early 30s when he was starting in that part. And then by the first part of the 60s, it was pretty well gone.
So if he was only in his 50s, what did he do after that?
My father died when he was 50,
Wow.
and the other Staples brothers kind of faded out of the poultry business slowly. And, it came and went, as it did in every town around Waldo County and other places in the state.
Because I think they shut down the last poultry processing plant in Belfast in the early 70s, I think it was.
Yeah. So that's,
So what did your grandparents do? Did they have a farm?
my grandparents grew up on Roy's farm. That was their farm.
What did they raise?
Cows mostly, I think. They weren't in the poultry business. That came later. But I think they raised mostly cattle and probably a mixed variety of farm animals. But the poultry business, the poultry industry here in town would have been after their life, that would not have been. My grandmother lived into the 60s, I guess. I don't remember when
She died in 73.
did she 73? So she saw the change in that, but when they were raising kids, there would not have been poultry in the mix.
No.
Anyone else have any comments to make? You're welcome to make comments. Yes.
I got a question about the gentleman that man was talking about at the beginning. His last name was Stevens,
Yes,
but you called him Steve?
Steve,
Okay,
but he was Ralph Stevens.
okay. Was he a bachelor farmer or did he have a family?
He had a wife and an adopted son that was a little older than I was. But they never had, they never had any children of their own. And his wife was an extremely good cook. She could make molasses cookies.
And donuts.
Yeah, and you could go in that kitchen in the summertime, August, and there was no other way to cook them but to kick that stove up, that wood stove. The doors would be open and it would just be sizzling hot in there. But I remember going in there and being cookies on the stove, on the end of the stove, great cookies. Anyone else have comments?
I have a comment.
Yes.
The chicken nests that were in Roy's garden, we were getting ready to build a barn at my house. And at this time, it would have been, that I have in my barn for my few chickens that I have.
Yeah.
So, even in later in years, I mean, this would have been probably when he was in his 80s or 90s, I'm not sure how old he lived to be.
Think
My
it-
grandmother lived to be 93,
Yeah.
and she was born in 1905.
Mhm,
And I think they were pretty much the same age.
mhm.
But anyway, he was still thrifty and he was also very generous. He would help anybody out. We were a young couple starting off and we wanted to do this and he said, come and get them. So we didn't use those pry bars, but we used pry bars to take them apart and to build a barn. And I'm grateful for that.
Yes, thank you, Rita.
Do you have the picture of Andrew on the hill, on the hay, the oxen?
I probably do. That the one? I think, David, that's right up on top of the hill with a team of oxen.
Any idea what year that might have been
Well,
approximately?
some of those were dated 1913. So I would place it somewhere in that category, but not specifically in 1913, but likely close to that.
By the 40s, were they baling hay or doing small round
In
bales?
in the late 40s, after World War II, World War II was a big deal. It shut down a lot of, you didn't have the things you have now, the things you had afterward. And I think that in the, after World War II, you started seeing farm equipment become available. And I remember Roy purchasing a New Holland baler that was a big heavy mechanism, and it had the compressor that went up in the air. Later on, they changed that design so that they pushed this way and this way. They weren't the type that came down. And Ralph Stevens was one of the persons that the big drawback that they had with those early balers was the tying mechanism, tying the rope on the bale. And they had a seat right on the side of that baler for a guy to sit and fix the knotting mechanism when it broke. And Ralph was the one that got that job. Was riding herd on the knotting mechanism.
It happened often enough, you had to be attending it all the time.
Yeah, right. But this wasn't quite that. And on the, but on this kind of hay, the track is still in the barn there, where they would drop a hook down and pull a lot of the hay up and bring it inside. That would have been more in this time period. Anyone else? Good.
The women at that time too did a lot too. Roy's wife Elizabeth, she was out there with the sheep, whether it was night, day, or whenever, when they were birthing or whatever. And the whole neighborhood's children could come in and see what was going on, and she welcomed us. And Roy's mother was still alive at that time. Like you said, she went into the 70s or 80s.
I'd say 70s.
And she was grand to all of us. Her name was Rose, and she was grand to all. Everybody in the neighborhood called her Grand. And, but they all worked together. Liz was right out there, and like I said, doing the sheep, or she'd go to the auction and come back with a donkey. I don't know that Romy
Yes.
agreed to that, but us kids liked it.
Get back to the only ones.
Yeah, yeah, so, yeah, I was a neighbor of this, so we were back and forth. I know during
Thank you. You ready to wrap up?
Anybody
That's
have
great.
any
I'm
other
glad
questions?
that people were here to make comments. I don't think of everything, certainly.
You can tell them how you used to clean the eggs.
Oh, you mentioned that.
Yeah.
Bonnie asked me about cleaning the eggs, about how you used to have a piece of sandpaper that went in your hand with elastic around the top. You remember that, Cecil? And you kind of sanded the shit off.
There you go. Early 60s.
And they
Yeah.
would sell the cracked eggs for 25 cents a dozen, and people would come Sunday morning.
Yeah, Sunday morning was
You buy
pretty
cracked
popular
eggs.
day.
You
Yeah.
couldn't do that now, you couldn't
No,
sell a cracked
no.
egg.
And the other thing I know you've talked about too, Norris, the common dipper in the egg room. They-
Oh, yes.
You go ahead and say.
Oh, yes, yes.
Tell them about that.
Well,
How
you
that
did.
all
I
works.
mean, it was just hanging up there, right? You just grabbed it and took a drink. It wasn't
And
it
didn't
wasn't
make any
really,
difference whether it was a hired man that had been chewing tobacco or whatever.
Yep.
When you wanted a drink, you went in and you took a drink out of the same dipper that everybody else did.
probably that tobacco
So we
juice,
were all immune to everything, I think.
probably that tobacco juice kind of self-sterilized them.